Welcome to Cheat Sheet Tales, where secrets slip, lies unravel, and the truth always has a twist. Real stories, raw confessions, shocking betrayals. Drop a comment if you've ever caught a red flag too late. Now, let's get into today's tale. 2 out of 10. Brielle's words landed with the weight of a judge delivering a sentence. She didn't even look up from her laptop screen as she spoke, her manicured fingers continuing their rhythmic tapping across the keyboard. Your quarterly performance rating. I sat there in her corner office, watching her finally lift her eyes to meet mine with that practiced expression of disappointed authority. The morning light streaming through her floor-to-ceiling windows created a halo effect around her perfectly styled auburn hair, and I realized she'd positioned herself deliberately to achieve this exact visual power dynamic. 2 out of 10. She repeated, leaning back in her ergonomic chair with the slow precision of someone savoring each syllable. Your work lacks soul, Sienna. It's technically adequate, but there's no spark, no innovation, no passion driving your output. My name is Sienna, by the way. Yeah, I know it sounds like my parents were hippies, but they weren't. My mom just really loved nature. And honestly, growing up with a name that means peaceful grassland probably prepared me better than I realized for moments like this one. Before I dive deeper into what happened next, could you please take a few seconds to tell me in the comments where you're listening from? Because I want to know where my story is reaching across the world. And please like this video, subscribe to my channel, and hit that notification bell, because what I'm about to share with you is something I've never told another living soul. And I promise you've never heard anything like it before. Perhaps you'd be better suited to something more entry-level. Brielle continued, her voice carrying that particular tone that successful people use when they want to sound helpful, while delivering devastating news. Administrative work, maybe? Customer service? Something that doesn't require the strategic thinking and creative problem-solving we need at this level. I nodded slowly, maintaining the same neutral expression I'd perfected over 8 months of working under her leadership. I understand your concerns, I said quietly. Thank you for the feedback. What Brielle couldn't possibly know was that for those same 8 months, I'd been conducting my own evaluation, not of my work, but of hers. See, Brielle had built her entire career on a foundation that most people never bothered to examine. She'd climbed from marketing coordinator to regional director in just 4 years, always managing to take credit for her team's successes, while deflecting responsibility for any failures. She had this incredible talent for being in the right meetings, saying the right buzzwords, and presenting other people's ideas with just enough modification to claim ownership. But I'd started to notice something. In our departmental meetings, Brielle's contributions were always either obvious observations that anyone could make, or vague strategic statements that sounded impressive but meant nothing concrete. When clients asked specific technical questions, she'd deflect to team members. When upper management requested detailed project analyses, she'd delegate the actual work while keeping the presentation role for herself. So I decided to test a theory my college roommate Noelle had started, her own consulting firm after graduation. Small operation, but legitimate, with real clients who needed real solutions. I asked her for a favor that required some creative explanation. I need you to create a fake freelance opportunity, I told her over coffee one Saturday morning. Something that would appeal to a marketing director with delusions of grandeur. Noelle raised an eyebrow but didn't ask too many questions. That's the beauty of friendships that survive your early 20s. Sometimes you just trust each other's judgment, even when the request sounds insane. Within 2 weeks, Noel had crafted the perfect bait, a mysterious new wellness startup supposedly, backed by anonymous investors, needed a marketing strategist to develop their launch campaign. The pay was generous, the timeline was flexible, and most importantly, the work would be evaluated by a panel of industry professionals who would provide detailed feedback. The only catch: everything had to be submitted under a pseudonym to protect confidential business information. Getting Brielle to bite wasn't difficult. I simply left Noel's business card on the break room counter, along with a printout of the job posting. During our next team meeting, I casually mentioned hearing about an exciting freelance opportunity and wondered aloud if anyone with the right expertise might be interested. "Oh, I couldn't possibly take on additional projects," Brielle said with false modesty. "My current responsibilities are far too demanding." But I saw her slip the business card into her portfolio. 3 days later, she'd submitted her application. While Brielle worked on her freelance project, I implemented phase 2 of my evaluation. Through LinkedIn, I'd connected with Talia Vasquez, who ran recruiting for our biggest competitor. Talia and I had met at a conference the previous year, and she'd mentioned being frustrated by candidates who interview well but can't deliver substance. "I'm doing some informal research on leadership competencies," I explained during a casual lunch meeting. "Would you be interested in seeing how different management styles translate to actual output when removed from their usual support systems?" Talia was intrigued. She agreed to set up informational interviews with several candidates, including one Brielle, under the premise of exploring potential future opportunities. The interviews would be recorded for training purposes with permission and would include practical exercises that revealed actual strategic thinking abilities. Brielle, of course, couldn't resist the opportunity to interview with our primary competitor. She scheduled her session for a Friday afternoon, claiming she had a dentist appointment. The third component of my evaluation was the most elegant. My neighbor's daughter, Maren, was completing her master's degree in organizational psychology. Her thesis focused on identifying incompetent leaders who succeed through manipulation. Rather than skill, she needed case studies involving real workplace interactions. "I need someone to observe and document leadership behaviors in natural settings," Maren explained when I introduced her to the concept. "But it has to be someone who won't modify their behavior if they know they're being studied." "What if this person thought they were mentoring a promising young professional?" I suggested. "Someone they'd want to impress rather than see as a threat." Maren smiled. "That could work perfectly." I arranged for Maren to intern in our marketing department, specifically requesting that Brielle take her under her wing. To make the assignment more appealing, I suggested that mentoring an intern would look excellent on Brielle's annual review, especially given her ambitions for the senior director position opening next quarter. "She's brilliant," I told Brielle, showing her Maren's fabricated resume. "Top of her class at the university. Incredible analytical skills. Really eager to learn from someone with your experience." Brielle pined at the flattery and immediately agreed to the mentoring arrangement. For 6 weeks, Maren shadowed Brielle through meetings, project planning sessions, and client interactions. She took careful notes, asked thoughtful questions, and gradually built a comprehensive psychological profile of someone who had confused authority with competence for so long that they lost track of the difference. During this time, the results of my 3-pronged evaluation began trickling in. Brielle's freelance submission for Noel's fake startup was enlightening. The industry professionals reviewing her work, real marketing experts who had no idea whose campaign they were evaluating, were uniformly unimpressed. Comments ranged from lack strategic depth to feels like generic template work. to show's fundamental misunderstanding of target audience psychology. One reviewer noted, "This feels like someone trying to sound smart without actually having anything meaningful to say, all buzzwords, no substance." The average score across 5 professional evaluations to 0.4 out of 10. Talia's interview feedback was equally revealing. Without her usual team to provide backup, Brielle struggled to answer basic strategic questions about market analysis, competitive positioning, and campaign effectiveness measurement. The practical exercises designed to test real-world problem-solving skills exposed someone who could recite marketing theory but couldn't apply it creatively. "She presents well initially," Talia noted in her summary. "Confident, articulate, clearly experienced in corporate environments, but when pressed for specific examples or asked to work through hypothetical scenarios, she becomes vague and defensive. I wouldn't recommend her for any strategic role." But it was Marin's psychological evaluation that provided the most damning evidence. Subject demonstrates classic symptoms of professional imposter syndrome compensated by aggressive overcompensation, Marin wrote in her preliminary findings. Rather than acknowledging knowledge gaps, subject deflects through authority assertion and blame displacement. Observed repeatedly taking credit for subordinate contributions, while positioning herself as quality controller rather than creative contributor. The psychological profile painted a picture of someone who had learned to mimic leadership behavior without developing actual leadership skills. Brielle had become so skilled at playing the role of a competent manager that she'd convinced herself she actually was one. As all this evidence accumulated in a secured folder on my personal laptop, I maintained my usual professional demeanor around Brielle. I accepted her criticism during team meetings, nodded respectfully when she shot down my ideas, and continued producing the high-quality work that she would later present as examples of effective leadership guidance. But internally, I was preparing for a confrontation that would reshape everything. The opportunity came exactly 3 weeks after my devastating performance review. Brielle had scheduled our follow-up meeting to discuss my improvement plan, essentially a series of unrealistic goals designed to justify future negative evaluations. "I've been thinking about our last conversation," I said as I settled into the same chair where she delivered my 2 out of 10 rating. "And I realized you're absolutely right about the importance of honest performance evaluation." Brielle smiled with satisfaction. "I'm glad you're taking this seriously, Sienna. Professional growth requires facing uncomfortable truths about our limitations." "Exactly," I agreed, reaching into my portfolio. "Which is why I think you'll find this interesting." I placed the first document on her desk, the industry evaluation of her freelance marketing campaign, with her pseudonym replaced by her real name. Her smile flickered slightly as she read the first few comments, but she maintained her composure. "I'm not sure what this is supposed to." The second document was Talia's interview assessment, including direct quotes from Brielle's responses to basic strategic questions. Now the confidence was draining from her face, replaced by a growing alertness. That reminded me of a deer sensing danger, but not yet certain of its source. The third document was the most damaging, a professionally formatted psychological evaluation, titled Leadership Competency Assessment. Subject DREVERY behavior pattern. Every deflection technique, every moment of exposed incompetence was documented with clinical precision. "You see, Brielle," I said, my voice remaining calm and conversational, "I've been conducting my own performance evaluation, not of my work, but of yours." She stared at the papers, her face cycling through confusion, recognition, and dawning. horror as she began to understand the scope of what I'd done. For 8 months, I've been documenting the difference between your public performance and your actual capabilities. When stripped of your title and support system, these assessments were conducted by industry professionals who had no idea. They were evaluating Briel, Regional Marketing Director. They were simply reviewing the work of an anonymous candidate. I leaned forward slightly, maintaining eye contact as I delivered the final blow. Your average performance rating, from real industry experts, to 0.1 out of 10. Turns out your work lacks soul, too. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire. Briel's hands had gone completely still on her desk, and I watched the color drain from her cheeks as the full implications settled in. She wasn't just looking at professional criticism. She was staring at evidence that her entire career had been built on a foundation of smoke and mirrors. "Where did you?" she started, then stopped, her voice coming out rougher than usual. "How did you get access to industry professionals who would evaluate your work honestly?" I finished calmly. "Turns out that's not very difficult when you remove the protective barrier of your job title and corporate hierarchy." I reached into my portfolio again, producing another set of documents. But wait, there's more. The next papers I laid out were screenshots of her rejected applications to 3 different companies, all positions she'd applied for secretly over the past 2 months, believing she was ready for an even bigger role somewhere else. Each rejection letter included detailed feedback that echoed the same themes. Impressive on paper, disappointing in substance. "You applied to these positions thinking you were ready for promotion," I observed. "But here's what's interesting. Each of these companies contacted your references. Not the ones you provided, of course, but colleagues who actually witnessed your day-to-day performance." Briel's breathing had become noticeably shallow. That's impossible. "Reference checks are confidential." "They are," I agreed, "but professional networks aren't. When someone from our industry reaches out to verify a candidate's reputation, people talk, especially when they have strong opinions about someone's actual contributions versus their claimed achievements." I placed the final document on her desk, a comprehensive report compiled by Moran, complete with behavioral analysis, leadership competency scores, and direct quotes from their mentoring sessions. The report was formatted to look like an official corporate assessment, the kind that HR departments use for promotion decisions. "This is particularly interesting," I said, pointing to a highlighted section. "Your intern has been documenting every interaction you've had together. She's a graduate student in organizational psychology, and you've been her primary case study for incompetent leadership masked by corporate positioning." Briel finally found her voice, but it came out as barely more than a whisper. "You can't do this. This is harassment. It's unethical, is it?" I tilted my head, genuinely curious about her reasoning. "Because everything here represents your actual performance when evaluated by the same standards you apply to others. I didn't fabricate anything or lie about your capabilities. I simply created situations where your work could be assessed without the protective influence of your position." She was scanning the documents frantically now, her eyes darting between the various evaluations and assessments. I could see her mind racing, trying to find some angle, some way to discredit what she was seeing. The freelance work was done under false pretenses, she said, grasping for solid ground. If I'd known it was being evaluated by industry professionals, using standard criteria, I interrupted. How exactly would that knowledge have changed the quality of your strategic thinking or creative output? She didn't have an answer for that. Here's what I find most fascinating, I continued, settling back in my chair with the relaxed posture of someone holding all the cards. You spent months telling me that my work lacked passion, creativity, strategic vision. You positioned yourself as the authority figure who could recognize these deficiencies in others. But when your own work was subject to anonymous professional review, it received the exact same criticisms. I leaned forward, my voice taking on the same helpful tone she'd used during my devastating review. Perhaps you'd be better suited to something more entry-level, administrative work, maybe customer service, something that doesn't require the strategic thinking and creative problem-solving you've been pretending to possess. The words hit their target with surgical precision. Brielle actually flinched, recognizing her own phrases being reflected back at her with calm professionalism. "What do you want?" she asked, and I heard something I'd never heard from her before. Genuine vulnerability. "I want you to understand something," I said. "For 8 months, I watched you tear down my confidence, question my capabilities, and make me doubt my own professional worth. You did this while knowing that your evaluation of my performance was the primary factor determining my career trajectory within this company." I gestured to the papers spread across her desk. "But the entire time you were judging my work, your own capabilities were far below the standard you claim to represent. You've been masquerading as a competent leader while producing output that real industry professionals consider fundamentally flawed." Brielle's composure was completely shattered. Now she was staring at the documents like they contained evidence of a crime she'd committed but couldn't remember. "I worked hard to get where I am," she said weakly. "I earned this position. Did you?" I asked. "Because based on these evaluations, it seems like you've been promoted beyond your actual skill level and compensating through authority rather than competence." I stood up, gathering my things with deliberate slowness. "I've made copies of all these assessments, not to threaten you, but to ensure that future evaluations of my work are conducted by someone whose judgment has been validated by professional peers. You're going to show these to management." There was panic in her voice now. "I'm going to request that my next performance review be conducted by someone else," I said simply. "I'll explain that I've lost confidence in your ability to provide accurate professional assessments, and I'll provide documentation supporting that concern." The beauty of my approach was its perfect reasonableness. I wasn't making accusations or demands for revenge. I was simply presenting factual evidence that called Brielle's professional judgment into question, using the same standards of evaluation she'd applied to me. "But here's what's really going to happen," I continued, my voice taking on a sharper edge. "You're going to realize that everything you've been telling yourself about your professional capabilities has been an elaborate self-deception. You've been playing a role for so long that you forgot you were acting." I walked toward her office entrance, then paused and turned back. "Oh, and Brielle, you might want to reconsider that application for senior director. Based on these professional evaluations, you'd score even lower when competing against candidates who actually possess the strategic thinking and creative problem-solving abilities the position requires." I left her sitting there, surrounded by the evidence of her professional inadequacy, and I have to admit, the satisfaction was overwhelming. Not because I'd destroyed her career, I hadn't, really, but because I'd forced her to confront the truth about her actual capabilities, using her own standards of evaluation within a week. Word had spread through the office in that mysterious way that corporate gossip always travels. Not the specific details of what I'd done, but the general sense that something significant had shifted in the power dynamic between Brielle and her team. She became noticeably more tentative in meetings, less quick to dismiss others' ideas, more likely to ask questions rather than make pronouncements. It was like watching someone who'd been performing confidence suddenly become aware that their audience could see through the act. The most dramatic change was in her treatment of me. Gone were the condescending comments and casual dismissals. Instead, she seemed almost wary, like she was walking on uncertain ground and couldn't quite figure out where the stable footing was. 2 weeks after our confrontation, she scheduled another one-on-one meeting. I expected some kind of retaliation, maybe an attempt to turn the situation around on me. Instead, she looked exhausted. "I've been thinking about what you showed me," she said, her voice lacking its usual authoritative edge. "And I need to ask you something." I waited. "How long have you known?" she asked. "About my limitations." The question surprised me with its directness. "I started suspecting about 6 months ago," I answered honestly, "but I wasn't certain until I created situations where your work could be evaluated independently." She nodded slowly, like someone accepting a diagnosis they'd been dreading. "The other evaluations I've been receiving, from upper management, from clients, they've always been positive, because they were evaluating your team's collective output," I explained. "And because you're very skilled at presenting other people's work in the best possible light. That's actually a valuable ability, but it's not the same as being able to create that quality of work yourself." Something shifted in her expression. Not anger, but something closer to relief, like she'd been carrying a weight she could finally set down. "I don't know how to fix this," she admitted. "I don't know how to become the leader I've been pretending to be." And that's when I realized my revenge had accomplished something I hadn't expected. It hadn't just exposed Brielle's incompetence. It had created an opportunity for actual growth. "You start by acknowledging what you don't know," I said, "and you stop evaluating other people's capabilities when you haven't honestly assessed your own." She looked at me with something that might have been gratitude. "Would you be willing to help me understand where I need to improve?" 6 months later, Brielle was a completely different manager. Not perfect, but genuine. She'd enrolled in executive coaching, started acknowledging her team's contributions more explicitly, and most importantly, stopped using authority to mask incompetence. My own performance reviews improved dramatically once they started reflecting my actual contributions rather than serving as vehicles for someone else's insecurity. I received the promotion that Brielle had been blocking, and eventually moved into a role where I could implement the kind of strategic thinking that she'd spent months claiming I lacked. But the most satisfying part wasn't the professional advancement. It was watching Brielle transform from someone who used power to hide weakness into someone who used honesty to build actual strength. She'll never be a brilliant strategic thinker, but she became a decent manager who supported her team instead of undermining them. Sometimes revenge isn't about destroying someone. Sometimes it's about forcing them to see themselves clearly enough that they can choose to become someone better. The corporate world is full of people like Brielle, individuals who've learned to mimic competence so effectively that they've lost track of the difference between performance and substance. They climb the ladder through political skill rather than professional ability, then use their positions to mask their limitations while diminishing others who might expose their inadequacy. But here's what I learned. When you force someone to confront the truth about their capabilities using objective standards, two things can happen. Either they double down on their deceptions and eventually self-destruct, or they accept reality and use it as a foundation for actual growth. Brielle chose growth, and honestly, that was a better outcome than any traditional revenge could have provided. If you've ever dealt with someone who used their authority to make you question your own worth, I want you to remember this. Their evaluation of your capabilities says more about their insecurities than your actual potential. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is create situations where the truth becomes undeniable. And if you're someone who recognizes yourself in Brielle's story, someone who's been performing competence rather than developing it, there's still time to choose growth over deception. But it starts with honest self-assessment, not elaborate performance reviews of other people's work. That's my story. If it resonated with you, please hit that like button and let me know in the comments what you thought about this approach to workplace justice. Subscribe for more stories about finding strength in situations where you thought you had none. And ring that notification bell, because I promise, you've never heard anything quite like what I'll be sharing next. Thank you for listening. And remember, sometimes the most devastating revenge is simply revealing the truth.